Hello, Peter4789 Cyrus here, and welcome to Sirus Gaming Corner, a gaming podcast where I, Sorceress1390, and usually Force Reviews, talk about various gaming topics. From new games to old, everything is fair game. And Force is still out, unfortunately. So for today's episode, like the past few episodes, it'd just be me and Sword. How's your evening, Sword?
Going good. Good Halloween. Gonna play some horror games.
Speaking of Halloween, we're literally recording this on Halloween right now.
Yeah, so it'll be a belated Halloween episode when it comes out, but hey, it's still a Halloween episode, so.
Yeah. Fitting that theme, I guess we should talk about horror games today, at least more extensively, since we have talked a bit about horror games before in a past episode.
Yeah, not too terribly in depth, so I think it kind of and a good expansion.
Since you're more the expert here, since I barely play any horror games, I guess you should have the floor.
I guess I'll quickly talk about kind of my exposure to it. Mm-hmm. So I've been exposed to horror games ever kind of since like the start of the PS2 era. A little bit of background was when we first got our PS2, Silent Hill 2 had just come out, and my dad was a pretty fairly big gamer back in the day, and he got Silent Hill 2, and I was like, I want to say like probably 7 years old when it came out. And, you know, I didn't really know what I was looking at. It was kind of just like a creepy looking thing. I didn't really think much of it. My 7-year-old brain wasn't really, I couldn't really wrap my head around it. But that was kind of my technically first exposure. Then Silent Hill 3 came out, and I was a little older, and I couldn't even watch my dad play it because I was way too scared. I could not play it. For the longest time, I couldn't touch a horror game, and I couldn't even watch horror movies for the longest time. Like, it was a genre that I stayed far, far away from. And fast forward to like kind of high school years, I want to say I think when I was like a senior in high school, I don't know why I did this, but I looked at my gaming shelf and I spontaneously booted up Silent Hill 3 and played it all through myself. And even though the game did still scare the hell out of me, I actually did manage to beat it, and it ended up like absolutely like blowing my mind in terms of how I could not believe, despite it being a very terrifying game, I couldn't believe how well written the story was and how engaging the characters were in the themes. I couldn't believe. I thought that I had it in my head that the game was literally there just to scare you and didn't have anything else going for it. But I was actually dead wrong, and it made me actually want to check out more horror games. So I got Silent Hill 2 almost immediately afterwards, and I played through that all the way through, and I loved it just as much. Controversial, not a controversial opinion, but I'm just gonna say right now, I know everyone loves Silent Hill 2, but I think 3 is just as good as 2. Now, not better, not worse, but just as good. So yeah. Anyway, so kind of over the years, I ended up just I started to get more exposed to horror movies, and I played more horror games. And even though I definitely haven't played anywhere near as many horror games as I have RPGs, for example, because that's my main genre. But horror games I played a pretty decent amount of, and it's definitely, I'd say it's probably my second favorite genre. It's a genre that I'm very fond of. I love the tense atmosphere. I love kind of like some of the darker themes and mature themes that they can go for, because they're not like, they kind of have that luxury of being able to tackle like some very dark and disturbing themes that we'll talk about later in some of the other games I played. But yeah, that's kind of my history with horror games.
As for my history, it's not much. Does The Last of Us count as a horror game?
It can. I think it has horror elements. Yeah. I think.
Like I played games of horror elements like The Last of Us more than actual like horror games.
Yeah, because some games do kind of sometimes like the mesh.
I watched my brother play the Evil Within Us, the first one.
Okay, yeah, I played some of that. That's a good game.
Can Resident Evil be counted as a horror game for the later installments?
That one's a little touchier.
Because we played Raccoon City,
and let's just say the horror was nowhere to be found.
I've actually played recently Resident Evil 4 this weekend for the first time.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, but then that's like, some people say that's not like, Resident Evil 4 is like the gateway to Resident Evil not being a horror game anymore. But that's what some people think, with it leaning much more to action.
Yeah, it kind of is. I haven't played it myself, but it looks like it leans more into like kind of like a third-person shooter or or whatever it is. But
I mean,
not, yeah, kind of.
it still uses tank controls, but like there's a lot more emphasis on killing every zombie or infected person.
Yeah, because I feel like a big part of horror games is like kind of sometimes it's not always in your best interest to fight, it's to run. Whereas if from the clips I've seen in Resident Evil 4, it's kind of like it's like the main not main appeal, but a big part of it is the combat as actually fighting a zombie.
But yeah, I guess I've read visual novels that had horror elements in it. Like Fate Stay Night has horror elements in it, especially Heaven's Feel. Tsukihime is like a supernatural horror with various aspects of horror in it. So I guess.
Ever read Doki Doki Literature Club?
I saw like video clips of it. I think I saw pretty much the entire game through it.
Oh, okay, gotcha. That's pretty scary too.
But yeah, the most horror theme like thing I've played is probably horror visual novels.
Still say that counts for something though, to be fair, because like it was like I was mentioning before, a part of what makes horror games I think work is the fact that they can have like those kinds of stories, those and have like darker, like more taboo themes too, so I think that visual novels can absolutely fall into a horror category for horror games.
Yeah, that's basically my history.
So I think a big part of them that makes them work horror games so well is atmosphere. Like, have you seen clips of any of the Silent Hill games, like the earlier ones?
Yeah, I saw clips of Silent Hill 2.
Okay, yeah. And like that, one of the things I love about that series, and this is something that other horror games have emulated too, but I think that Silent Hill does it the best, is like a lot of the times the environments are very grimy and have like the walls are caked with blood, and you got all these very indescribable industrial noises. You have the sound, the static of your radio whenever monsters come near you, and I love how you'll hear the monsters before you even see them, so it gives this sense of anticipation. And that's another thing that horror games do effectively, or at least that's kind of what they should strive to do, is build anticipation. Like in Silent Hill 2 and 3, there were times where I'll be hesitant to walk through a door because I know that there might be a monster behind it, and I'm like, I need to like prep myself. So that's how you kind of like building up anticipation and atmosphere, I think really makes, and also a use of sound, like I said, kind of just not even just music, but just industrial noises like banging sounds in the background and things like that to create a really tense atmosphere. I think that's a big thing that makes horror games effective.
I'd probably say like the sound. I feel that part too when I'm playing through some of the horror visual novels. Especially like not only the intensity of the music sometimes, or like the very grimy sound effects, but also the lack of music sometimes.
Yeah, and that's the other thing too. Sometimes no sound can be just as effective because it also builds anticipation. And like I said, I was saying about like how they can tackle like taboo themes in their writing is like, I know I keep mentioning it only because it's so popular, but I'm just gonna keep using Silent Hill 2 as an example, just because that's the one that almost everyone's familiar with. This isn't limited to Silent Hill 2, but it's just a prime example. Is that like the characters in that game are so mentally and emotionally broken, and that like even I love how like the characters, they seem normal on the surface, but all of them are, to put it bluntly, are beyond fucked up. They have so much trauma and baggage, and once you kind of unveil their stories, they're so fascinating and they're sympathetic. And even though sometimes they're very flawed, especially the protagonist James. Everyone knows the twist, but I'm not going to say it just for the sake of anyone who hasn't played it just by any chance. But once you unveil James's backstory too, and learn about his trauma and the things that he's done, it's like he seems like a totally ordinary guy on the surface. His story is essentially just he gets a letter from his wife who died of a disease, his wife Mary, saying, "Oh, come to our special place in Silent Hill." And then since his wife's dead, he's got nothing really else to live for, so he thinks it's just a pipe dream. But you know what? I gotta let her. I want to kind of figure out what's going on. Maybe she's here. Maybe she's there. I don't know. And then you feel for him, but then you learn things about his past, and all of a sudden, you know, he becomes a very morally questionable character, but he's so fascinating. My God. And all the characters are like this. And I love how another character deals with like sexual abuse. There's another character who deals with a very intense bullying and just completely snaps. And I mean, I could go on about like the layers of Silent Hill 2. And then Silent Hill 3's cast is a lot different. It's not as much about like personal trauma, even though it delves into that too. But like for example, the protagonist Heather Mason is like she's just a teenage girl, and she her past is a lot more. It's not as grounded as James's. It's more about like the cult, and it's all supernatural. But like she's still a very fascinating character, and I love her inner monologues. She's doesn't really show a whole lot of fear sometimes. She could be emotional when the situation calls for it, but she kind of takes everything in stride, and she's a very endearing character. And I mean, I'm talking about, I know it's Silent Hill specifically, but like a lot of horror games do this. They delve into the psyches of the characters. I think to talk about not necessarily more obscure, but kind of a lesser known one that I played that I personally really enjoyed was a game called. You ever heard of The Medium?
Yeah.
So that's a horror game that actually it doesn't have any combat. It's exclusively puzzle based, and it feels more like
Is the puzzles time based?
no, they're more yeah, they're like more situational. There's like a couple parts where there might be a time limit of some kind, but in general, like it's more
So
like oh
is
you
there
know
there's no like actual mechanics that make you unhinge, except for like the story elements?
basically, yeah. The only time you could ever actually like die or fail is there is a monster that is recurring throughout the course of the story that does have a backstory. It gets explained what it is, but for a majority of the game, there are times where there's this monster. They call it the Maw, and it'll pretty much chase you. And part of the puzzle sometimes is figure out how to get around him without him catching you. And there's things like that. But in general though, it's more like it's really just about kind of solving the puzzles, and it also tells like it actually feels like an homage to some of the Silent Hills. It's got like the fixed camera angles, it's got all the industrial noises. Hell, it even has a Akira Yamaoka doing the soundtrack, at least part of the soundtrack. So you can tell where they got some of their inspirations from. But like a big part of that story is the protagonist in that game. Her name's Marianne, who, just like the title suggests, is a medium. And just like Silent Hill 2, she ends up getting called to in the medium's case, it's a resort, not a town, but she gets end up calling to a resort and kind of learns more about her past. So you can kind of tell where they got some of their inspirations from. But the directions that story goes in is also very interesting. It's clearly inspired, but it's not it's not a direct carbon copy. And learning about kind of her family, her what she's doing at the resort that she goes to, and what happened at the resort because everyone there was a the backstory is there was like an unknown and unspecified massacre that killed pretty much everyone in the resort, and that's kind of part of the mystery is uncovering what happened at the resort, what killed everyone, and finding out how Marianne has an attachment to it. And the ending of that game is very controversial. I can see why. I think that's one of the only things about the game that I can say is legitimately kind of not that good is the fact that I think the ending doesn't really make a whole lot of sense logically when you look at the rules of the story that they established. But otherwise, I don't think it ruins the game or anything. The rest of the game is still extremely well written for the most part, and it does have a pretty interesting cast of characters. Even the characters that are like despicable end up being at least interesting. Like you might like detest a certain character, but intentionally. So that's a point for the medium also. So it's got really clever puzzles for the most part, an engaging story, and it's got the atmosphere going for it. It's got the sound design. Yeah. So and then there's other ones like Fatal Frame is another one. I'm sure you've heard of that one. It's pretty
Yeah.
popular too. The Fatal Frame.
You take a picture of the ghost.
Yeah, exactly. That is one of the most clever game mechanics I've seen in a long time. Because this is a recurring thing in the Fatal Frames. Like every protagonist in each game uses that camera. It's called I think it's called the camera obscura, I think, or something like that. And it has like supernatural properties, which is why it's able to to defeat the ghosts. And you can actually customize your camera in each game and give it special properties. You can increase the damage. You got to make sure that the ghost is like perfectly in the frame, and that's another thing that does great anticipation is like you're trying to get a perfect aim, get the perfect shot, because the better the shot you do, the more damage you do to it. So, and the case of the first game, the closer the ghost is to you, the more damage you do. So you got that anticipation of, oh, I gotta let the ghost get close to me, and man, they are creepy. And then the closer they get to you, you see these horribly disfigured faces, and then but you got to do that so you can get the most amount of damage. So it's a really effective, like the Fatal Frame, the first one specifically, does everything right, although I think that the storytelling is kind of misguided, only for the simple fact that the story is told exclusively through like notes and journal entries, and you got to like read walls and walls of text, and if you miss one, or if you don't really want to read all that much, you're going to miss the entire story. So I think Fatal Frame 2 does a much better job at telling its story, because it kind of mixes both that as well as telling the story properly in cutscenes too, instead of just making you kind of dig it for yourself. I mean, I know that's an acquired taste. I'm not saying I think that's like objectively good or bad in the case of the first game, but it is something that I personally wasn't a fan of. I'd rather the story just be shown to me rather than told through walls and walls of text. But I think that Fatal Frame, the first game, pretty much makes up for in nearly every other regard, between the atmosphere and the sound, and it's got all the makings of what makes a horror game great. But Fatal Frame 2, I think, does everything Fatal Frame 1 does but better, especially in the story department. I mean, yeah, I could go on, but overall, I think horror games are definitely one of my favorite genres. I think another thing too about horror games that makes them work is when you have kind of awkward combat. I know that sounds weird to sit. I'm not saying I want combat to be bad or unresponsive, but in the case of, again, Silent Hill, you're not pulling off crazy special moves. This isn't a Devil May Cry or Ninja Gaiden. You got your protagonist is an everyday average Joe, wielding a pipe and awkwardly swinging at monsters. And then I think that's what makes it work well, is because there is that kind of that uncertainty. Like, you're not playing as a character who's super capable in combat. You're playing as just a normal person. And then it also kind of makes you think, like, well, do I want to fight this monster with this awkward combat, potentially get myself killed or hurt? Or do I want to save my resources and try to run past it? And you know what I mean, like, there's that level of uncertainty that I love. Like I said, when I say awkward and clunky, I don't mean in the sense that it's bad, like it's bad or
it's
hard
like
to play.
Probably designed intentionally to not, like, it's an option, but it's not really the option you want to take when fighting like these supernatural beings, probably.
Yeah, exactly. It's not always like in your best interest, especially in a lot of horror games where there's like supplies are scarce, like ammo and healing items. It should be kind of a last ditch effort. So I think that's another thing that I like too. But yeah, that's kind of how I feel about horror games. It's definitely one of my favorite genres. I mean, I'm sitting at my computer, I'm looking at my shelf now, trying to think of some other ones. But I think that at the end of the day, what makes horror games so great in my book is, again, like atmosphere, having really great environments that capture the tone that they're going for. You know, the very dark stories and the psyche of the characters. It's just a really great genre that I think, I definitely recommend to people if they're willing to try something different. So,
like, I think like horror definitely has its place, even in non-horror games. It can be used as like a section where to keep you on your toes and give this really intense moment. And
yeah, like
remember Final Fantasy 15?
Oh God, they tried.
Yeah,
they tried. I'll give it that much.
I think, like, despite it being flawed, I do like how vulnerable you feel Noctis is, especially from before, where you pretty much felt like he was like, you played him as this like very accomplished swordsman who has the power of the kings at his side. But then to just be stripped of all that and like be very limited in your options to progress, and sometimes be like being chased by various enemies, and how your only option also is like not really
To
a strong.
run or
Yeah,
to...
yeah. Like I think that was effective in building an like heavy atmosphere, especially fitting when you go to Niflheim at that point where you see everything has gone wrong there.
Yeah, like conceptually for sure, I think that was a great idea, and being vulnerable and only having that the ring to be able to kill enemies, and you're kind of encouraged to either hide or run away. I thought that was execution is a totally different discussion, but like I think they had the right idea. I definitely give them credit where it's due. And another one you mentioned before too is I like Last of Us does have horror elements. Like there are parts where I actually felt genuinely unsettled in certain parts, especially like when you're fighting the infected. I think a part that sticks out to me in that game, the first one anyway. You remember that part when Joel falls down kind of like an elevator shaft, and he's in like this kind of like this a sewer like area, and he's separated from Ellie. He's by himself, and then you have to like turn on this generator, and that alerts infected. So as soon as you pull it the first time, all you hear is an infected off screen attack you. And they were the stalkers, I think they call them. And you're like, it completely catches you off guard. You don't expect it. You're just like, oh, I'm just gonna pull this, and then the camera, it has like a fixed camera when Joel pulls the string on the generator, and you pull it, and all you hear is this horrific clicker sound and off screen, and you're like, what the fuck is that? And then you got to fight a wave of stalkers. Like I think that's a really good part. Like and Last of Us does have elements like that. Like there are other good parts, like when you go to that high school with Ellie and Bill, and you're fighting the infected in there, and it's like all dark and so like there are parts of it that I think do have horror
Doesn't that
elements
school scene also ends with you fighting a bloater?
Yeah, that's the first encounter you have with the bloater. That was a great part.
Yeah, I think like the key elements to a horror game is vulnerability, uncertainty, and anticipation, like Sword said. And like those elements combined, if you do it well, like it does do a great job of creating an unnerving, intense atmosphere that really gets you sucked in.
Yeah, for sure. That's why. Yeah, I definitely think, and I do agree with what you said too. Is I like even non-horror games when they mix in horror elements, like we were talking about with Final Fantasy 15, Last of Us. I think that kind of it does create like kind of a different tone that they're going. So I think that's a mixing in that is cool. Another thing, I think last thing I can think of.
What do you think,
Oh,
like
go ahead.
strictly like body horror versus psychological horror in video games?
I mean, I think at the end of the day, I think they both kind of have their own place. Like psychological is kind of that's the kind of horror where I feel like that kind of gets under your skin. It's the kind of one where it kind of like makes the hairs on your arms stand up and you're unsettled. Whereas body horror, like for example, like in Last of Us with the infected, like some of the infected are absolutely like disgusting, but in the best possible way. Like you got like the clickers, they got like flowers growing out of, they're like plant-based monsters.
Yeah, like fungus or
bodies.
like fungus growing everywhere over them.
Mm-hmm.
And apparently,
Yep.
like this is based off of a virus that's in real life that can happen to ants.
Yeah, the cordyceps. Yeah, infects insects. So, but yeah, like at the I wouldn't say I have a preference as to which one I like more. I think if I had to choose, I'd probably say that I would prefer more of a psychological, because I want something that's like has a horror tone throughout the course of the game. Whereas for a body horror, it's like it's scary in the moment when you're seeing it, if that makes sense. Whereas like a psychological horror, like when the story is psychological and it's getting under your skin like that, that permeates the entire game, I think. Whereas like, I feel like if you just keep seeing the same terrifying monsters consistently, they kind of like lose their effect a little bit, unless you have a lot of monster variety. So, but like at the end of the day, I think they both have their pros. I'd say I don't think that one is. I mean, having a combination of the two is I think it's Silent Hill 3, in my opinion, I think has that in spades. Like it's psychological and also has what I consider to be like some of the most terrifying monsters I've seen in a video game, honestly. Like, so it's got both of those going for it.
What do you think of jump scares then?
Oh man. Okay, all right. I'll say this. In moderation, I think a jump scare can be effective. I think it can keep you on your toes a little. Like, if you're, I think 1 at max 2 jump scares throughout the course of either your game or your movie can work. That's what I actually don't have a problem with it when it's used on a very, very rare occasion. Because again, like I said, like if you're watching, for example, let's say you're watching a movie, a 90-minute movie, you're 40 minutes into the movie, there's been 0 jump scares, and then at that 40-minute mark, there's a jump scare, and that's the only one that you've seen. After that, you're on guard because you're like, oh my god, well, last time I let my guard down, there was a jump scare, and it caught me off guard. But what I don't like is when that's what the scares rely on. Is, oh, this is scary because it'll make you jump. That's not how horror works. That's not what creates a good atmosphere. So I think it ends up feeling, when it's used consistently or used too frequently, it ends up like feeling cheap. But again, like I think in moderation, like having one or two.
Like a jump scare should be used sparingly, but I think it works as like a good ending to like the build up of like a tense atmosphere that you get through like the just exploring area. Like there's like this one jump scare in Batman Arkham Knight where you're playing as Jim Gordon. Have you played Arkham Knight before?
I've seen clips. I haven't played it.
Like you're playing as Jim Gordon and just going through Batman containment cell and see like these people are like turning into the Joker. Don't question it. It's the comic logic. And then you see like you go through each containment cell and the atmosphere keeps building and building. And then you turn around and Batman's right there behind you.
And from the sound of it, that's an effective jump scare.
Yeah.
Like when it's just like, like one of the most irritating jump scares to me is like when if someone's like looking in a direction and then their friend just grabs them by the shoulder. Hey, I was looking for you. Like that bullshit just irritates the shit out of me. But like when it's something like that, or
like,
you know,
I think
it's
a jump
like
scare is good if it's like built up properly.
Yeah. Like I think it adds to suspense when you have like a good build up going and then it kind of ends with that jump scare. That's how you use it effectively. But yeah, used sparingly and used in a good context, like using contextually, I think it does work in its favor. That's how I feel about it. I think that there are some people out there that say, oh, they want none because they think it's cheap. Like I said, I think a lot of them can be cheap, but if used sparingly and in the proper context, they work. I think they can work well. That's how I feel anyway.
Do you think like the lack of, let's say, control in a horror game plays a big part in the scariness to a horror game?
I think it can. Like when you kind of have like a feeling of helplessness, it can add to the atmosphere. I think it also, just like anything else, it kind of depends on like execution too. But
I feel like the lack of control is especially apparent in visual novels, where you're just like playing and reading through these characters' thoughts as he like undergo these like messed up situation that he's at, describing the various horrors he's experiencing in both like physically around him or even in his mind if he's slowly going insane. And I think that's really effective.
Yeah, because you're just at the end in that kind of game, like a visual novel, you're just at the end of the day, you're just a spectator.
Yeah,
you don't have a say. Like, I mean, there's dialogue choices.
I mean, like,
things
you feel
like that.
as helpless as the protagonist, I think. Which is why it's effective.
And that's a good use of helplessness and creating that tension. So I think in depending on execution, like a visual novel, I think that kind of a lack of control actually really can work in its favor. A trend that I think has been going on lately that I'm personally not a fan of is there are a lot of developers that kind of seem to think that what makes a game scary is when you're defenseless, and like when you see a monster, your only option is to run and hide. I'm personally not a fan of that. I like having the option because I feel like I see there's a part of me that feels like it's actually scarier when you're forced to face this terrifying monster chasing you and not running and hiding in a locker.
I say, like, in those games, the horror is kind of lessened just because you know there is one option.
Yeah, like you're doing exactly what the game.
Even in a visual novel where you have options to do, you have various multiple options. Like there's only one option that's really the right option, but you still have the that feeling of choice you have, so you don't know which one to do in order to survive. But it's still effective because the choice is still there. Why?
You can make a choice, you can still fail,
Yeah.
and you know.
But like the fact that you don't have a choice in those games makes it the horror is a bit lessened, just because there's less uncertainty in it.
Yeah, because like in a game like Clock Tower or something like that, I know that if I run and hide in a locker or under a table or something like that, I know I'm going to be safe because that's the only way to get away. You know, I mean, I'm doing exactly what the game wants me to do. Whereas in a Silent Hill or a Resident Evil or whatever, you have that option of, well, I mean, I could spend a couple pistol bullets, or do I just kind of hopefully run past it and not take damage, or what do I, you know, I mean, there's like that's the biggest, one of the biggest things that horror games I think is effective is like kind of that choice and the uncertainty. Whereas, like I said, in a horror game like, you know, whatever, where all you do is run and hide, I'm doing exactly what the game is designed for me to do. So I think that, I don't know, that's just, I mean, I know that's kind of a different take. I know some people do think that being totally defenseless can add horror, and I'm not saying it doesn't, but it's just not my cup of tea. I think that having the option and having some defense, but also kind of weighing your options, especially with the scarce supplies, also adds different horror. So that's just how I feel about it.
Do you think playing a horror game is more scary than watching a horror movie? Generally.
I think in a lot of ways it can be, because you have that sense of control, and because, I mean, like with a movie you're just a spectator, whereas with a game, you know, I mean, like you'll be walking down some disgusting hallway and you hear an abomination across down the hall and you don't know what it is, and you know, but with a movie you're just watching it play out the way it's supposed to be playing out. Whereas that level of control in a horror game, I think, actually can make it more effective. I think, you know, walking through doors, not knowing what's on the other side. You know, you're walking, you hear some disgusting sound from ahead. You're like, oh, do I turn around? Do I go ahead? Do I get a gun? What do I do? I think it can be more. I think it a lot of times it can be more effective in terms of the kind of like the scare factor. Not saying there aren't great horror movies out there that aren't scary, but that's just how I feel about it.
Like I think like a game can be more effective in terms of like you're controlling this character, so you already feel like affinity with him, just because you are playing as them. And then a game also has the freedom for you to like slowly go explore these areas, and even in visual novel, you're slowly describe these various locales, so you do feel like you are in the character's head as you are exploring these like not safe locations. And I think another element that makes a horror game effective is just like the uncertainty factor is greater, kind of, just because like you don't know what you're doing is the right choice in a situation, because if you do the wrong thing, you might just get a game over and have to do the section again. But like
yeah, because at that point it's all on you as the player. You know what I mean?
Like in a movie, like there is a great deal of uncertainty if it's done right, but you know that the story is just going. The story is going its intended path. Why in a video game, you're not sure if it is going its intended path unless you play like a really linear horror game.
Yeah. Because in like Silent Hill, there's a whole bunch of options and ways to go about things. You know what I mean? So
I think like despite like we said, the lack of control is like one of the key factors will make a horror game scary. But I think like the illusion of options is another one, because it like makes you more uncertain about certain choices.
Yeah, for sure.
There you go. I don't know what more to add in this subject. Like I said, I'm not really well versed in this gaming genre.
It's funny. I feel like this is kind of like the other way around, where I didn't have as much to say about like visual novels because I had and that you kind of took the floor with that one. Now it's kind of like the opposite.
Yeah.
like I tried to pitch it as much as I could. So, but yeah, I pretty much said all I needed to say. So,
Okay.
I mean, I can't really think of anything else off the top of my head. So,
Okay.
I mean, I know it's one of our shorter episodes, but hopefully you guys enjoyed it.
Sorry I couldn't add more, but like I said, I'm not really well versed in this subject.
But we also figured, hey, it's Halloween, so why not?
Well, this is all for Sirus Gaming Corner. I hope you guys enjoyed it. This is Peter 47890 Cyrus signing off.
Take care, everyone.